All right, Ethan, if you want to take it away, we're all set.
All right. Well, I guess thank you everyone for tuning in for this webinar today to discuss Prison Policy Initiative's recent report on jail churn and jail admissions. I'm Ethan Corey. I'm a researcher and fact checker at The Appeal, and I'll be moderating this discussion. And with us, we have Wanda Bertram, who's a communications strategist at Prison Policy Initiative and who helped put together the report. Wendy Sawyer, research director at the Prison Policy Initiative, and co-authored the report. Alexandra Natipov, who is Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and author of Punishment Without Crime, How Our Massive Misdemeanor System Traps the Innocent and Makes America More Unequal. And finally, Dylan Hare, who's Senior Policy Advisor at Just Leadership USA, and who also helped put together the Close Rikers campaign in New York City. And I guess to get us started, Wendy and Wanda, it would be great to hear from you sort of why you all decided to start looking into this question, and why knowing how many people are admitted to jail is important to understanding how.
Absolutely. So I think we can start with kind of a basic truism about criminal justice reform, which is that a disproportionate focus, it tends to be placed on state and federal prisons. And of course, state and federal prisons are very important, but that basically means that the facilities and the processes that get left out of the national conversation on criminal justice reform are often city and county jails. And one of the reasons that that happens is because the conversation about jails suffers from a dearth of data in many different ways. So a lot of our work at the Prison Policy Initiative revolves around trying to fill some of those gaps in the data about jails. And with this report, we started out by trying to answer one basic question, which is quite simply how many people go to local jails every single year. That's a data point that we have and have had for a long time for state prisons and federal prisons, but because it's just so hard to aggregate the data that comes from all of these thousands of local facilities and jurisdictions, it hasn't been available for local jails. We haven't had this national number, how many people are going to local jails every year. So we set out to answer that question. So the report that Wendy and my other colleague Lexi wrote answered it beautifully. We used a data sample from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is a survey that's administered by, I always forget how to pronounce the abbreviation of that agency. SAMHSA, yes. What does that actually stand for again?
Oh boy.
Never mind. It's it's a federal agency focused on mental health, drug use, and other health issues, and as such, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health is mostly concerned with health questions, but it also contains some really helpful questions about the respondents' engagement and involvement with the criminal justice system. So that's a long way of saying that the survey that we got data from had asked respondents, have you been to jail in the last year? Have you been to jail multiple times in the last year? And other questions about their involvement with criminal justice system. And that was how we were able to get the first national estimates of how many people go to jail every year. So to circle back to kind of the importance of this data, what we now have is the closest estimate that's been produced ever of how many people are going to these local jails on a yearly basis. And we found that it's at least 4.9 million people. That's important just for all of the reporters listening. I think we should probably, I'd like to just clarify one thing, which is that a number that we have had in the past is the number of arrests every year, which is much larger, right? Because some folks are going to jail multiple times. So the number of arrests that occur every year is somewhere between 10 and 11 million. But now we kind of know, how many of those arrests, how many unique individuals are we talking about when we talk about 10 or 11 million arrests every year? And Ethan, I think I'm not hearing you right now.
You're right, I was muted.
No problem.
So what I was saying to, I guess, just myself was, you know, from your report, what were sort of the biggest or most striking findings for you all about, you know, who it is that actually makes up this 4.9 million people who go to jail each year?
Right. So Wendy, you can jump in anytime if you think of things you want to talk about. But just on a broadly speaking, the points that we really wanted to pull out in our report were that. So we were able to do, using the same data sample, a demographic analysis of people who go to local jails every year. And what we found is that, as you might expect, people who are in deep poverty, people with incomes under $10,000 a year, people with you know, low educational attainment, who've been excluded from educational systems, Black people, and surprisingly to some people, I think folks that are dealing with a variety of different health issues. All of those groups are overrepresented among the number of people that go to jail every year. We also found that of the about 5 million people who are going to local jails every year, about at least 1 in 4 are going more than once. So that's just kind of a broad overview of what we found, and we can go a little deeper if you want into any of those different demographics.
I think it would be great to hear more about this smaller subgroup that you talked about that went to jail 3 or more times a year. What was different about them from both, you know, the people who only went once or twice and from the population?
Yeah, so you know, like I said a minute ago, what we found about the population of folks that are going to jails is, broadly speaking, that they're dealing with these chronic health issues, including mental health and substance use disorders, and they disproportionately suffer from deep poverty. And for the most part, what we found is that people that are going to jail multiple times every year, we see those same trends, only, you know, even more pronounced. And so, you know, for example, about 60% of people that were arrested 3 or more times in 2017 reported having some kind of substance use disorder. And, you know, that matters because, you know, jails say a lot about how counties are investing their public resources, right? It's in a lot of counties, you know, police and jails are basically used to take care of people, you might say, I mean, without actually caring for them, to take care of them as a social problem, by warehousing them, or putting them in a facility overnight. So all this kind of gets to some policy recommendations and some ideas for how counties can change their systems.
And what kind of policy recommendations were they?
So right, so broadly speaking, you know, what we recommended in our report is that counties need to start shifting some resources away from jails, jail expansion, and law enforcement, and towards the kinds of social services that can keep vulnerable people out of the jail system in the first place. You know, so it's not, you know, there are programs that counties can institute, you know, such as, you know, there's a number of programs like New York City and Denver have implemented programs to provide permanent supportive housing with mental health and other kinds of, you know, they call wraparound services to people that are chronically homeless. So that's like that's an example of a very tailored program designed to keep incredibly vulnerable people out of the jail system. And those programs have been successful. On the other hand, or on the other end of the kind of the flip side is that we're recommending a disinvestment in law enforcement and jails. So this kind of ties into a report that we released earlier this year called "Does Your County Really Need a Bigger Jail?" Which is effectively, it's a list of about 30 questions that counties that are considering building bigger jails to cope with overcrowding can ask. Because building new jail space, which more and more counties are doing right now, is incredibly costly. And if you look at who's going to jail, what you realize is we could solve these problems of local overcrowding in our jails by expanding access to substance use and health and mental health resources.
Great. And Dylan, this might be a good place for you to jump in and talk a bit about how the sort of higher level of needs typical of people who are being incarcerated in jail impacts you know, efforts to reduce the jail population. I know your organization wants to cut that in, I guess, half by 2030. So how do we tie together these sort of dual problems of reducing the jail population while meeting the needs that, jail has in a highly imperfect way been sort of meeting for some people right now?
Sure, no, that's a really good question. And I think the best place to start that conversation is with sort of a general acknowledgement that this horrible phenomenon of jail churn does not begin when someone comes into jail. It begins when you, as a policymaker, make police and prosecutors your primary investment into a community. Because once that decision is made that you're going to take an entire community and divest as far as business opportunities, educational opportunities, community-based services, support structures, once you take those things out of a community and put in their place police and prosecutors, you're going to create an effect that we now know as jail churn. And it feeds itself, right? I mean, this is something that prison policy and others have really looked into and have done an amazing job exposing in a very real way, really reaffirming the lived experience of people who've been through jail. The reality is that if you're in jail, even just for a short period of time, that significantly increases the chances that you're going to get a conviction on the charge that landed you in jail in the first place. It increases the chances that you're going to have worse outcomes, even if you don't get that conviction, but once you get out of jail and back into your community. So the idea that someone would be in jail for a long period of time ends up creating this cascade of consequences that then makes it harder to obtain the services that for the large majority of folks are already sort of inaccessible in the communities that they're going back to, right? So there's a whole kind of cyclical thing that's happening here even before the physical structure that is a jail comes into play. So to answer your question, how does that then translate into some of the work that we can do? I mean, if you look at the Close Rikers campaign here in New York City, the second half of the Close Rikers slogan is build communities, right? The idea that as Close Rikers continues to focus on shrinking the size of New York City's system and the footprint of the system and continues to find ways to limit the system's ability to hurt people, the system will inevitably become smaller and there will be less money directed toward it, hopefully. And then you take that money and put it back into the communities that have been the most directly harmed by Rikers and the other city jails, right? There really needs to be a one-to-one, if not better, matching component in terms of how we think about divesting from law enforcement, from correctional agencies, from probation agencies, from jail facilities, divesting from all of those and investing into the communities that have been most harmed by those facilities and by those structures and by those mechanisms. So I think, it sounds cliche and simple, I think, in some sense, to say, oh, just, divest, invest. Movement for Black Lives and others have strong divest, invest platforms that a lot of advocates look to as kind of models. Hopefully the Build Communities platform that the Close Rikers campaign released ends up becoming another model of what that divestment and investment can look like. But I think that really is kind of where we have to begin, right? We have to acknowledge the reality that the phenomenon we're dealing with is in many ways the necessary consequence of budget and policy choices that have been made for decades and decades in communities across this country. And then we allow that problem to feed itself because we refuse to intervene with these community-based services and with actual investments.
Great. And I guess one thing I'd be curious to hear your perspective on is one of, I guess, sort of the challenges and controversies in the discussion over how to close down Rikers is sort of this issue of do we need to, while also doing that, put money into building new jails in New York City. And I know your organization supported the mayor's plan that it did involve building these 4 community jails. Can you talk about, I guess, sort of how the high needs status of the jail population played into that conversation or into that calculus?
Sure, and I think the best way to answer that question is to just point out from the get-go that we actually did not support the mayor's plan for closing Rikers. Close Rikers had advanced from the get-go our own plan and our own vision for what the process of closing Rikers should look like. And yeah, our plan called for the building of 4 borough-based facilities, but it also called for a significantly reduced population capacity compared to what the mayor's plan was. It called for significantly more investments in communities than what the mayor's plan had offered. So that's one area where there was a lot of differences, right? Is that the mayor had his plan, we had ours, and we were really pushing city council to adopt something much closer to ours, which they ultimately did at the end of the day. Not at all, not perfect, obviously, and not as not where we wanted everything, but certainly a big step, we think, in the right direction. But in order to get to our plan, right, a lot of things had to happen, right? So we had to, first of all, a lot of organizations across the state, including Just Leadership through the Free New York campaign, had been pushing for pretrial reforms, knowing that a vast majority of folks in jails across the state and in New York City are there pre-trial, held on bail, right, waiting for discovery, not having access to actual speedy trial rights. So we pushed for reform, and one reform to sort of affect change in all those areas. We continue to push for parole reform, right? The only increase in population at Rikers Island is people accused of technical parole violations. Continuing to push for reform to drop that population. We've demanded from the get-go that anybody who's in a city jail with a diagnosed mental health condition be immediately removed from the jail and offered the community-based services that would actually address that underlying need, right? So every single lever of decarceration that's available is a lever that the campaign has been pulling for a long time. The reality is, though, even with all those levers being pulled, in the near future, there are going to be people who are detained in New York City, right? And so until that population of people gets to zero, which is a goal I think a lot of us share, I know certainly we do as a campaign and an organization, until that milestone is hit, then the conditions within which people are detained really matter and will really make a difference. And the ability of people to be proximate to their communities, to their families, to the courts, to their legal services, to other things like that is also really, really important. So you have to kind of factor that all in together and recognize that this application, the ULERP application that was just voted on by City Council last week, is probably the only chance in a generation we would actually have to advance a meaningful plan that, number one, sets us on the path towards permanent decarceration, and also offers us a chance to actually close Rikers in the very near future, and then built on top of that as an entire, like I said, community investment framework that a lot of organizations across the city have been pushing and will continue to push. Because like you said, this cannot be a one-track solution, right? We can't just shut down facilities. We can't just invest in communities. We have to do both at the same time. And so as we vastly reduce the number of facilities in any jurisdiction, we have to also vastly increase the amount of money and resources we're giving to local communities that have been impacted by those facilities.
Great. And I guess pivoting a little bit, Professor Natipov, your recent book talks about the sort of huge impact that the misdemeanor criminal justice system has on the criminal justice system as a whole. And I was hoping you could talk a bit about how this plays into the issue of jail churn, and especially how it intersects with the criminalization of behaviors linked to mental health problems, substance use disorders, or homelessness.
Sure. So I want to emphasize a comment from the very beginning of the conversation, which is that our focus and our deeper understanding and consensus around mass incarceration over the past decade or so is a felony-focused conversation, and in many ways a prison-focused conversation. And we are only now just turning to appreciate the full breadth of what it is our criminal system does, not on a federal, state, and local level, and jails are an enormous piece of that story. So the research and the new scrutiny and the new data in this arena is so important, not only because it gives us a more accurate picture of the criminal system we actually have, something we haven't really had until now, but also because it changes the way we understand mass incarceration itself. In many ways, the misdemeanor system, the low-level system, is running its own version of mass incarceration, and that's taking place largely through jails, not through prisons. So it's an expansive way of understanding the debate that we've been having over criminalization and mass incarceration, for quite some time, but that has not included misdemeanors and has not included jail. So it's a really important moment in the conversation. I want to also just emphasize how important the new research is and the new data and new reports like this, because we don't know enough about this piece of mass incarceration. We keep very good track of who goes to federal prison, and we keep terrible track of who goes to jail. And so we're just starting to see, I think, more scrutiny and a better understanding of that. So, for example, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, tells us that in 2017, there were 10.6 million jail admissions nationwide. The prison policy report that we've been talking about lets us drill down to understand who many of those people are, some of the who's coming in and out of jail more often, but there's still so much we don't know about those numbers, the relationship of those numbers. John Jay Criminal College is doing new research and generating new reports about our misdemeanor system, about misdemeanor arrests. I'm trotting out these resources for journalists who may be listening, who may be interested in following up on some of these threads. Measures for Justice, which is a brand new data collection organization, is also starting to collect this kind of data, jail admissions, arrest rates, and so forth. And so I think over the next few years, over the next period of time, we're going to get a much better picture of how the low-level criminal system actually works, how many people are in it, and why. You asked me to talk a little bit about the impact of the misdemeanor apparatus and its relationship to jails. And jails are one piece of that enormous machinery. Jails, of course, are central, but low-level arrests, bail, debtor's prison, stop and frisk, many of these phenomena that we have studied in silos or reported on in silos for some time, we can now understand in relationship to each other. And I think, and many of the folks on this call have pointed this out, that they are that all these pieces have to be understood in relationship to each other. So jails are related to policing practices, which are related to community investment decisions, which are related to arrest rates, which are related, as the investigation into the Ferguson Police Department in 2015 taught us, related to the funding sources that local communities and municipalities and courts rely on. So it's an enormous set of institutional relationships that have given us the kind of opaque and low-level criminal system and misdemeanor system that we have.
Great. And one thing in your response that I think is really interesting is you pointed out that a lot of our conversations around the criminal justice system have focused on the felony legal system and prisons. And in part that's because, a 10-year, 20-year sentence sounds a lot more impactful than, getting 3 months in county lockup. But I'd be curious to hear, why is, say, a 3-month sentence in jail? Why is that in many ways, also very destructive in comparison with, these longer prison sentences for felony crimes?
Yeah. So I teach criminal law and criminal procedure, and I always warn my students at the beginning of the semester never to say they only went to jail for a few days, that there's nothing only about it. Jails are dangerous places. They're frightening places. They can be violent and oppressive places. People get sick in jail. We now know far more after the death of Sandra Bland how oppressive they can be and dangerous they can be. The consequences of going to jail and any brush with the criminal misdemeanor system are far broader, I think, than many people appreciate. And you're right that one of the reasons that we haven't appreciated it is because for so long, jail admissions, misdemeanor convictions, misdemeanor arrests, being on probation, fines and fees have been overshadowed by the profound harshness of our felony system, of our mass incarceration system, of those mandatory minimums and those long prison stays. Now that we have come, I think, to a better appreciation, a better consensus of the harms of felony mass incarceration, we can come to appreciate just how harsh the misdemeanor system itself is and just how punitive it is to go to jail. So going to jail, for example, often can lead people to be evicted. They can lose custody of their children. It can interfere with their credit. Obviously, it interrupts their lives on top of the frightening and violent and intrusive and coercive quality of being locked up in jail for any period of time. The lawsuits around the country, fascinating lawsuits that are challenging debtors' prison practices in many local jails, have focused in on the terrible conditions of these jails. People packed into small cells, women deprived of sanitary and feminine products, people without access to their medication and their inability to communicate with their family and their attorneys. Especially at the local level, many of these jails maintain inhumane conditions of the kind that have been litigated in prisons now for many decades. We haven't held jails to the same level of accountability as prisons, in part because we've dismissed them. We've dismissed them as places where people don't stay for very long. They're not as serious, perceived as serious as prisons, but they're very serious, and people can end up staying there for a very long time.
And I want to open up the floor now to all of our panelists for this question, which is the Prison Policy Initiative report talks a little bit towards the end about a few models for reducing jail admissions, such as supportive housing programs in Denver and New York City. But I'm curious to hear from all of you what models for reducing jail admissions look like, and examples of that in practice that you think journalists should be looking at if they want to learn more about potential solutions.
Well, I'll jump in first, and I just want to highlight something about Denver. So the examples that we were talking about, both in Denver and New York, they're both, as I said before, examples of cities taking action to provide both housing, which gives people some much needed stability, and also wraparound services, which are tailored to kind of every person, to provide those things to this core group of people who are sometimes called frequent utilizers of both jails and emergency rooms. And the theory behind this, I think, and some of the rationale behind this is often that it will save the city money. And in fact, in Denver, that was kind of the premise behind the entire way that they structured this program. So Denver's program is leveraged through what's called the social impact bond model. And what that means is that rather than fund experimental programs with public money, with taxpayer money, what Denver did was it invited investors to put some money in to fund these new programs for supportive housing and wraparound services, and basically said, if these programs work at saving the city money, we will give the investors back whatever we saved. If they don't work at saving the city money, you don't get anything back. So there is a lot of risk, right? It's not like investing in a private markets investment. It's different from that, and it requires more of a philanthropic and charitable view on the part of the investor. But at the same time, I just want to highlight that this is a model that Denver chose because it was strapped for funding, and I think that just underscores how the responses that cities and counties can have to this problem are going to vary based on a few different factors, and one major factor is what is the tax base, right? And where are its sources of funding coming from? So while Denver had an incredibly kind of economical model that leveraged a public and private partnership, other counties could do something similar, but only use taxpayer money, or they could go in the other direction and mostly use private money. That's a little bit technical, but I think it's kind of just worth saying that these models are adaptable, and cities should kind of look at, how do we identify people's needs and then figure out, based on how our local government works and what's available to us, kind of what works locally. So That's my humble contribution just to start.
Yeah, I would add also that a lot of places that have been trying to implement some of these reforms are really just working on like consolidating their existing resources, like the program in New York that we mentioned in the report, this FUSE program, which is that stands for Frequent Users Services Enhancement. And that model has been replicated in like 20 odd other jurisdictions. But that's about like the city had a lot of resources and they just needed to pool them together and make use of them more efficiently. So, you know, it didn't have to seek out, well, I'm sure there was additional funding, but they were also using the funding that was already sort of committed to homeless services and mental health services and things in the city and just coordinating those efforts. And likewise, the Safety and Justice Challenge that the MacArthur Foundation is funding, a lot of those sites have strategies that are relevant to this conversation. And many of those also involve just coordinating existing like nonprofit efforts and getting people to sort of centralize all of their resources and to coordinate in terms of data and in terms of like who's providing what services and streamlining those things so that it's not wasteful in any way and they're able to reach more people and be more effective. So there's a number of those Safety and Justice Challenge sites that journalists could look at. I don't know, I can talk about more of that if you want, but generally speaking, there's a lot of things where folks are just like looking at what do we already have? How can we make better use of it?
Right, right.
Yeah, I can jump in with two quick, I guess, ideas or points. So I would just say, as far as a list of possible solutions or places to look, I mean, I tend to go to Prison Policy Initiative when I need these answers. So I would obviously tell everyone to go there. And there's other, you know, places too, like the MacArthur Foundation has a lot of good information on their website now. Measures for Justice is mostly a data portal, but if you play with it, you can kind of get a sense of where change might be happening. I would just say from sort of a policy/advocacy perspective, there are really two questions I think every jurisdiction should be asked if we're going to start looking at their jail populations and what that intake looks like on a cyclical basis. And the two questions are, number one, based off what we were just talking about a second ago, what are the data sharing agreements or practices like between your jurisdiction's multiple agencies? Who's in charge of that? Is there a single person in charge of that? What are the difficulties with it? You know, speak to people in the agencies who are working on these different issues or problems and really dive in to get a sense of what data sharing looks like and why it isn't happening. And the second thing I would sort of love to see, and obviously the appeal does a really good job of this, but since we're sort of talking to a bit of a broader audience, is thinking more about, thinking less about investments into particular issue areas. So, you know, less about, well, this city spent X dollars on housing and Y dollars on jails and Z dollars on schools, and think instead about how much money is going into a community and then how it's broken up into multiple different buckets, right? Because I'd be willing to bet that if we started having stories and reports that came from that framework, we'd see that the primary investment, again, in a lot of communities is a law enforcement-based investment, right? And even though it sounds good that we're saying, you know, they spent $5 million on health services or $10 million on schools, when you compare that to not just other investments at that time, but the totality of investments over the course of a generation, I'm pretty confident that you're going to see some trends that are really, really troubling, and that also really clearly explain why jail churn, quote unquote, is a thing that happens for a lot of these places. And I only put it in quotes because I wish there was a better, more humane way to describe the problem. I mean, the phenomenon is real. But I think those are two real questions that I hope reporters and journalists can sort of begin diving into and begin shedding some light on, because it would be really helpful, I can just say from a policy perspective, to know exactly who's being held accountable on those specific issues.
I think that's completely right. And, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Professor Nadapoff.
No, please, go ahead.
Well, I just had a quick comment based on what Dylan was saying, which is that, you know, I think it's absolutely necessary that journalists start to see, you know, investments and decisions about things like housing services and medical services, social services based around substance use problems and mental health problems as completely connected to jail policy and the amount of funding that's going towards law enforcement. I think that sometimes, you know, as we talked about in some of our previous reports, sheriffs that are pitching an increase in jail capacity, right, or new bigger jails, that they have sort of an advantage in the public discourse, which is that they can pitch they can pitch this idea that there's a risk in hitting a jail that's overcrowded, and that's a public safety risk. But really, I mean, there are ways of maintaining or decreasing jail populations while also increasing public safety, and that requires these investments in community services.
I was just going to say, I think these are all extremely important points and pieces of the puzzle. One way to ask the question is, what would it take to shrink the low-level criminal system, the misdemeanor apparatus, and reduce its reliance on incarceration across the board? And we can think of it as posing an institutional challenge to each of the major players in the system. So legislatures, for example, can decriminalize. They can take incarceration off the table as punishment for traffic offenses and low-level offenses and order maintenance offenses. Police, of course, can engage in fewer arrests. Prosecutors can convert fewer of those arrests into criminal charges that carry jail time. So we're seeing progressive prosecutors around the country, like Rachel Rollins, make it part of their platform that they're going to decline low-level charges in cases where the offensive arrest are low-level misdemeanors like disorderly conduct or loitering or trespassing, and that's a way of making sure that people spend less time or don't go to jail at all. Courts can stop using jail as a mechanism of debt collection. It's really at the heart of the debtor's prison challenge that courts have gotten accustomed to using incarceration as a debt collection tool. Part of that is a policy matter. Courts have some authority to do that, but some of it is enforcing the Constitution. A lot of that incarceration is unconstitutional and in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. I want to say one word about the law, because we've been talking about policy and we've been talking about jails, but I think it's worth recognizing how the Supreme Court and how constitutional doctrine has made the situation possible. I just want to mention two leading cases that contribute to this phenomenon of over-incarceration in our local jails. And the first case is a case called Atwater versus Lago Vista. It was a case about arrest. And what the Supreme Court held was that anybody can be arrested and therefore incarcerated in a jail for any minor offense, no matter how petty, even if that offense itself does not carry jail time. So the fact that in the Atwater case were of a mother who was arrested for a seatbelt violation with her kids in the car, the seatbelt violation itself carried no incarceration. The maximum penalty was a $50 fine, but she was arrested and jailed subject in connection with the arrest prior to the adjudication of that offense. And so that's one of the ways that we fill the jails, is by permitting arrests for traffic offenses, for offenses that have been decriminalized or don't carry any jail time, to trigger incarceration nonetheless. And the other case to note is a Supreme Court decision called Riverside versus McLaughlin, which held that if you are arrested, the state has 48 hours to detain you before you have to be brought before a neutral detached magistrate to decide whether there was probable cause for your arrest in the first place. And it's just worth seeing how the Supreme Court has made possible an enormous amount of low-level incarceration upon arrest and while waiting for cases to be adjudicated based solely on the discretionary decisions of police officers.
One other piece of this issue that I'd be curious to hear more about is, aside from the question of like the social service or the needs that people who are ending up in jail have that aren't being met, there's also the question of, how should the criminal justice system be responding to offenses that right now either carry jail time or, as Professor Natipov was just describing, might not carry jail time, but still carry the risk of arrest and pretrial incarceration, because of course we know that pretrial incarceration makes up a huge percentage of the jail population. So what are some approaches and solutions that we could be taking with respect to that issue?
Could you clarify a little bit could you clarify your question a little bit? Like what kinds of actors are you talking about, or what kinds of change areas are you talking about?
Sure, yeah, sorry. I guess the two pieces I'm most interested in here are sort of, I guess, one, the issue of pretrial incarceration. What are approaches that policymakers, legislatures, courts, prosecutors, whatever, can be taking on that issue? And then the second is sort of the vast misdemeanor criminal justice system described by Professor Natapoff. What's the approach there? Is it decriminalization? Is it declining to prosecute? What are, I guess, some of the relative advantages or disadvantages of these?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll throw out a couple of examples just to start with. I mean, there's a few different ways that we lay out in our July report about, or June. When we release that, who knows? Does your county really need a bigger jail report? We lay out a few different ways that counties can implement pretrial reform, and that's a great resource for learning about that. PJI, the Pretrial Justice Institute, is also a great resource, for journalists listening who want to do more reading on that. But first, it's just important to say that pretrial reform will not necessarily change the number of people that go to jail in a certain area, but it will change, by getting those folks, out of jail earlier or diverting them from jail entirely. It will change the amount that jail impacts their lives, which is something that Professor Natapoff and Dylan have both spoken to really well. Even a stint in jail that lasts only a few days can really tear someone's life apart, and allowing them to be with their families and in their communities while their case moves through the system really allows folks to keep their lives together a little bit more during that period, which is a pretty chaotic period, as you might expect. So obviously the pretrial reform that's gotten the most attention is reforming money bail, or requiring judges to only impose money bail based on someone's ability to pay. But there are also, another reform that a lot of jurisdictions have implemented is risk assessments, which basically gives judges a different tool for deciding how much of a risk someone poses, either to the community or as what they call a flight risk. So what's the chances that if you're released from custody pending your trial, that you're going to flee the county. I think rightly, risk assessment tools have come under a lot of fire for reproducing the same biases that tend to show up when individual judges will decide who gets to go free before trial and who remains in jail. So for the most part, racial biases and other biases that are kind of built into questions like, have you had prior criminal justice contact? But those are kind of reducing money bail and implementing risk assessment practices are just two. Can you think of any others off the top of your head?
I mean, we haven't talked much about like using citations in lieu of arrest, but that seems like a no-brainer. So instead of actually arresting someone, just giving them, a summons to appear. That seems like a pretty, especially for a lot of these low-level offenses, that seems like an obvious choice.
Mm-hmm. Right, not even like arresting somebody at all. You can also, I think jails can also adopt practices that help people's cases move through the system a little bit faster. So instituting requirements that nobody's case that nobody's sit in jail for days and days without going before a judge for an initial hearing. You can limit the time that they're going to spend in jail before they see a judge initially, and you can limit the time they spend in jail before they go to trial. Is that right?
Yeah, and you can also like prioritize some cases for faster processing, especially if someone is being held on money bail, something like that. So you can offer different kinds of bail bonds. Like there can be unsecured bonds, which are just where you have to pay only if you don't show up to court. So there's no money up front, so it doesn't have that same barrier for folks who can't afford to pay their bail bond, or to buy a bail bond, let's say. So they can get out just with the promise to appear, essentially. I mean, there's a lot of ways they can go about it. we haven't talked much about diversion, but there's a lot of diversion programs that can be done at both the like pre-arrest stage, the pre-charge stage. So there's a lot of points at which people can intervene to make sure that people don't go to jail and instead go to the appropriate community-based services.
Right. One last thing, you know, to mention is that, you know, counties can institute pretrial services, and that can mean a lot of different things, but you know, mainly I think what it's important, what a lot of people don't know is that failure to appear rates are often driven up by things like people just forgetting to make their court date. It's not like someone fled the county deliberately, but perhaps they forgot, or there was an actual logistical impediment to them making their court date. You know, they had a different appointment, they couldn't get someone to take care of their kid. Just, you know, everyday obstacles like these that come up for you and me that prevent us from making like doctor's appointments can also prevent somebody from making their court date. And there's a variety of pretrial services that counties can implement to lower the rate at which this happens. So for example, text reminders that let someone know, you know, hey, your court date's coming up. Or another example is courts providing some kind of childcare so that if you have to come to court with your kid, you have a young child, you have somewhere to put that person while you're in trial. So there's all sorts of things that counties can do to reduce pretrial incarceration. But really, I think what's important is that counties start to take some kind of action, because right now it seems like a lot of counties are willing to just kind of continue with the status quo and continue to incarcerate hundreds or thousands of people pre-trial every day, people who are still legally innocent.
Yeah, I would just add, go ahead, please.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, just to add two quick sort of notes on top of that. Number one, you know, as Wendy and Wanda were alluding to, I think one thing that advocates and policymakers have to be very cognizant of is not replacing one flawed system with another. And I wouldn't even say jail is flawed. I think it's working the way it was designed, which is to essentially inflict harm on people in a sort of pretty efficient way. But you can't replace that system with another, right? So you can't replace jail with electronic monitoring, for example, which has its own series of problems. As Wanda and Wendy were alluding to, just leadership in a number of organizations are very strongly opposed to the implementation of risk assessments, particularly in the pretrial setting, for the reasons we were just discussing. They tend to recreate biases, you know, but then we get questions sometimes along the lines of, well, if people are arrested and you know, what do we do with them pre-trial? Release them. I mean, they're legally innocent people. I mean, I understand that there's suspicion and procedurally that, you know, a bunch of things are about to commence based on that suspicion, even if that suspicion is even valid to begin with, which is a whole nother conversation we could be having about the way communities are selectively policed and the way policing is selectively enforced by prosecutors and sort of the chain of decisions that start from there. But I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that you don't want to replace these inherently harmful regimes and systems with other things that may seem good on the surface, but just below the surface are just as harmful. And the other thing I'd say too is that as much as we want to make sure that anyone who's in the system has more outlets, has more ways to get out than they do to get in, right? So if someone is being arrested, they can get a citation. If someone is arraigned, they can have pretrial diversion. If someone is sentenced, they can be sentenced to something other than jail or monitoring, right? As much as we want those outlets to exist, I think we also have to be careful to not continue to rely on that entire mechanism as the entry point into needed services, right? And I know Wanda and Wendy and others touch on this a lot, and a lot of the amazing work PPI and others have done. But we can't just say to a county, okay, you know what, take the 1,000 arrests you had last week and divert half of them away to something else. That's probably good for those 1,000 people who have already been arrested, right? But it's also creating a weird incentive to almost sort of arrest your way into the problem even more, because that becomes the only avenue towards community-based services, when the reality is those services should be separated entirely from the system. I mean, the system in many ways needs to be shrunk, and that includes from the jail perspective, and particularly with what we were saying in this conversation, now that we have data on the scope of this problem, I think the need to shrink that part of the system is becoming a lot more clear for folks.
No, I'll just agree with all with those points that we've criminalized the welfare net, that part of this jail problem is a reflection of the fact that we now launder those services through the criminal system in jails, but also at many junctures in the criminal process, and that's the prior more fundamental reform is to disaggregate welfare services and the social safety net from the criminal system. I want to double down on the point just made about not replacing one bad mechanism with another. Sometimes it's not even merely replacing it, but it can make it worse. So in the academy, we call it net widening, in the sense that it's not merely replacing, but it's replacing jail, for example, with electronic monitoring. Is a contentious example at the moment, given bail reform, because electronic monitoring actually makes it easier to sweep more people into the surveillance of the criminal system, and it also creates incentives for various powerful actors within the system to promote it. Whoever's running the electronic monitoring systems and making that. Generating revenue off of those services. We saw it in private probation, we see it in bail bonds, we see it in so many of these aspects of the criminal system, where by creating what look like more lenient alternatives, we actually incentivize actors to expand the system in the first place. And I've written about this more generally with respect to decriminalization and the use of citations and diversion. We come around to these solutions every 30 or 40 years. We revitalize our commitment to being a less punitive, less incarcerative criminal system, and that each of these well-meaning reforms has the potential, ironically, to expand our criminal system, to sweep more people in more easily, less expensively, and thus, ironically, exacerbate mass criminalization and mass incarceration.
I want to pick that up and kind of say one thing about being in a community, being a member of a community, and seeing crises happen, because I think one kind of stumbling block on the road to jail and police reform is that, if you're living in a society, you're always going to have crises take place. So someone on the street is going to have a mental health crisis, or there's going to be some kind of altercation that breaks out. And I think, something to really think about is that counties need and citizens need a body that or an agency that responds to situations of crisis without behaving the way that police have traditionally been trained to behave, which is to respond to feeling threatened by using force. So we've seen, and we found in our report, that people with serious mental health problems are vastly overrepresented in jails, and that's something that I think anecdotally most people know. But the problem is, that there have been programs that have been implemented in certain jurisdictions across the country, and they can work, where police are trained, given special training to respond to mental health crises. But depending on the context, it may be easier and avoid kind of widening the net, as Professor Nadapok was saying, widening the net of kind of police involvement in everyday life, to build up alternative agencies that are exclusively trained to deal with these problems, public health related agencies that can handle something like a mental health crisis without jail even entering the realm of possibility as a place that this person might end up.
And those do exist to a certain extent. Certainly there are like co-responder models where the police arrive, if there's been a report of someone having a mental health crisis, where they arrive on the scene with mental health, like trained clinical mental health providers, and can be diverted to appropriate treatment that way. So it relies a bit less on the police understanding what to do. But I agree that it would be best if we could just replace the police involvement aspect entirely. I think there are some small, like mobile crisis response units around, but it would be nice to see that implemented more widely.
Right.
Great. And I guess we're nearing the end of our hour. So before we go, I'd love it if each one of you could sort of briefly give, your takeaway, what you would hope the journalists listening to this would bring on to their readers and their audiences to help people better understand the issue of jail churn?
I would just say that I think that it's under-discussed how jails are misused and overused as just these sites for people who are struggling with other kinds of social and health problems, and that we're overly relying on jails. So just an awareness of that being a theme of jail use, I think would be a big step forward for most folks.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that for me, one of the big takeaways, both from our report and from this conversation in general, and definitely what Dylan and Professor Nadapoff have been saying, is that if you're a reporter and you're looking into your local jail, figure out who's there. It's how many people are being held pretrial, how many folks have a substance use problem, a serious mental health problem, how many are there only because they couldn't afford to pay fines and fees and are in deep poverty, how many are mothers and fathers of young children. I mean, these are questions that really start to push people to open their imaginations and to think, maybe there are solutions, maybe there are ways that we can get people back on their feet and help them live better lives that don't involve putting them in a jail cell. Because I think that what we desperately need right now is for more people to open their imaginations and think about other ways of solving these social problems.
I think the one thing I would say is to encourage everyone to speak to and really center the experiences and stories of people who've been in jails. And obviously they're not hard to find because there's literally thousands and thousands of them across the country. There was an incident in New York City over the past year where Paul Manafort, who I assume most people know by name at least, went to Rikers for a short while, and journalists started freaking out about how bad Rikers was and how horrible the conditions there would be and how traumatic it would be for poor Paul Manafort. And the reality is, Paul Manafort, no one should be subjected to the conditions at Rikers, right? But the things that Paul Manafort and his lawyers were experiencing are things that Black and brown communities in New York City have experienced for literally a century. And there are some reporters who've done a really excellent job at uncovering those stories, not just in New York City, but across the country. But certainly to talk about jail without letting the people who are in jail sort of talk about it from their own perspective and giving them the space to center their own stories and experiences, I think there's a real disservice to the nature of this problem and to the scope and magnitude of this problem. So I would just encourage everyone to actually speak with someone, to visit jails, to sort of be in the presence of those people and those families, and make the space for those stories to be the story when we're trying to have this conversation.
And it, as part of that effort to elevate the importance and the experiences of people actually suffering through the jail experience, there's so much more interest and information and analysis about not just jails, but jails' relationship to other aspects of the criminal system. And I think journalists can contextualize for their readers what piece of the puzzles jail represent. They're an important part of our criminal system, especially the low-level criminal system, and to understand that they don't operate in isolation and they don't treat people this way in isolation, but are part of a larger multi-decade debacle that represents so much unfairness in our criminal system generally.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. And of course, thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I think this wraps it up. So yeah, I hope y'all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.